welcome to the next episode, the fourth episode of Policing TV's powerful episodes regarding the scale and impact of male violence within policing. My name is Nazir Afzal. I was the Director of Prosecutions in London, then the Chief Prosecutor in the Northwest of England, and more recently, Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. But I'm delighted to be your host. We're intending to draw upon expert evidence, and you'll hear from those experts shortly, from both within and outside policing, which will enable us to have an informed debate and hopefully recommendations for radical and deliverable interventions. Policing.tv is the definitive digital repository for insightful commentary, for debate, and for analysis from global policing leaders. I hope it will become, well, I'm sure it will become, the essential resource for practitioners, commentators, officers, academics, and suppliers, allowing access to the opinions of key decision makers in their own words. The last year or so have been not that good when it comes to public confidence in policing. The policing of violence against women and girls in particular has come under renewed and widespread scrutiny. There is acknowledgement that police forces are consistently failing to protect women and girls from sexual and violent crime, and from violence even at the hands of police officers and staff. Many, for example, compared the terrible kidnap, rape, and murder of Sarah Everard as a watershed for policing in a similar way that the murder of Stephen Lawrence was more than 3 decades ago. The gap between what the public need from policing and what they get, especially for women, people of colour, and from marginalised communities, appears to have grown significantly. Trust, confidence, legitimacy appear to many to be broken. In episode 4, we're going to be focusing on routes to disclosure for victims and the practical support that they are entitled to. We will probably touch on issues such as whistleblowing, low-level concerns, victim blaming, and the use of language. We'll hear about how women from both within and outside policing describe a range of disturbing issues, including the fear of reporting, serious failures of investigation, officers being accused of using police powers to intimidate or discredit, and even cover up. What needs to change? That's what we're here to discuss. And with me, a phenomenal panel of experts. First, you're going to hear shortly from Donna Jones. Donna Jones was elected as Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight in 2021. She achieved 312,993 votes on the 13th of May. She was a magistrate, or has been a magistrate for 16 years or more. She's developed a very strong background in criminal justice. When she was appointed by the Lord Chancellor in 2005, she was at that point the youngest member of the judiciary in England and Wales. From 2014 to 2018, Donna was the first woman to be elected leader of Portsmouth City Council, presiding over a £780 million budget. She has a thorough understanding of managing public sector finances, generating new income, and removing wastage from the system. Whilst her professional background is banking, she's absolutely committed to policing and public confidence in it. After Donna, you will hear from Dr. Hannana Siddiqui. Dr. Hannana Siddiqui is a multi-award-winning researcher and policy advocate working at Southall Black Sisters and as a freelance consultant. I've known Hannana for far too long, 2 decades or more. She has worked on violence against Black and minority ethnic women and girls in the UK for 35 years. Her wide range of work has included undertaking casework, strategic litigation, and expert reports, as well as policy advocacy, campaigning, providing training to professionals and research, particularly in areas such as domestic homicide, forced marriage, honor-based abuse, and self-harm. After Hannana, you're going to hear from Professor Betsy Stanko. And Betsy, if there's any improvement in the way we deal with victims, Betsy's always at the heart of them all. She's been, and she currently is, the strategic advisor and joint academic lead for Operation Soteria Bluestone. This ambitious project, funded by the Home Office, is designing a new operating model for the response to and investigation of rape and sexual assault. She's also the external senior advisor to the Data First program, an ADR UK Ministry of Justice collaborative project for depositing justice administrative data in the ONS for use by researchers. She was in MOPAC. She's worked in a number of roles post-retirement, notably as independent academic advisor to the College of Vulnerability Program and the College of Policing's Knowledge Fund. I mean, I could carry on. Betsy, as I said, has been at the center of much of the improvement that we have in our justice system. And finally, you're going to hear from Rhona Malone. Now, Rhona, for over 10 years, was a committed and dedicated police officer and firearms officer within Police Scotland. In April of 2020, Rhona retired through ill health. In 2018, she had made a stand against sex discrimination and victimization, as to have done nothing, in her view, would have made her a hypocrite of policing and complicit in their behavior. The force, she believes, was inept in dealing with her complaint, which resulted in the promotion of her perpetrators, her career ending, and the deterioration of her mental health. Rhona's ethics and values clearly no longer aligned with the police for which she once admired and dedicated her life to. She faced prejudice, misogyny, obstruction, and an intolerance towards her quest for acknowledgement and accountability. Throughout the process, she was clearly obstructed, misled, and several attempts were made to silence her. Tactics were used to delay her tribunal, and her pay was withheld. She was punished for reporting discrimination, and no one wanted to help. In August 22, 2021, Rhona finally obtained justice and acknowledgement through an employment tribunal. It took over 3 years to get to that point. As we stand today, she's still seeking accountability from Police Scotland, from the Police Federation, the Scottish Police Authority, and the Equality Commission. As you will probably guess, we have a phenomenal panel of extraordinary experience. But as I said, we are trying to touch upon the experience of those who are victims either within the force or outside. And so my first call out to everybody really is to ask them to consider, where are we as it currently stands, in your view, in terms of victim confidence and the routes that are currently available for disclosure for victims? And what, if anything, do you think is changing? Donna, can I call on you first?
Thank you very much, Nazir. And it's such a pleasure to be part of this with an extraordinary panel of women who I hope are going to shed some real light on this issue, and the issue particularly around disclosure. And as you said, where are we with this at the moment? Before I get started on that, just for literally a couple of minutes, I want to just share a little bit about a more specific role that I have. So as well as being the Police and Crime Commissioner in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, I also have 2 national portfolios that I lead on. One is serious organised crime, and the second one is violence against women and girls, or the victims portfolio through the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners, the APCC. And so being the National Victims Lead jointly with Sophie Linden, who is the Deputy Mayor of London, we also encompass that VORG agenda, as that has really taken place, particularly over the last 12 months. And I think there's a number of things that I think we've learnt over the last year. I've given evidence at the Home Affairs Select Committee, and for those of you that are particularly interested in this topic, they've been reviewing some of the barriers to why women and victims come forward and don't report in the ways that they should. So those barriers to disclosure and to reporting. And it often is because of the duress they're under when there is such a long period of time between reporting and then the case getting to court. So some women will come forward and report, and men will come forward and report issues, but then they drop out of the system and they decide they don't want to progress, because it can be up to a year sometimes or longer for a charge to be brought against the perpetrator because of the protracted way the British legal system works. I've given evidence to the Home Affairs Select Committee last year, alongside Sir Tom Windsor and others, on the rape investigation and prosecution process. And I also attended, again with Tom actually, with the Home Secretary's National Policing Board at the beginning of December, again to talk on behalf of victims across the country about how we can break down those barriers to ensure that more people come forward and report the most serious of crimes, in particular rape and serious sexual assault. We've got the new Victims Bill coming down the line. I took part and supported the Ministry of Justice in the pre-white paper consultation on the new Victims Bill, and I hope that this will take a step forward, a significant step forward in breaking down some of those barriers in disclosure. But what has happened, in answer to your question, Nazir, what has happened over the last year has, of course, knocked the public's confidence and the police's confidence in that trust around our law authority in this country, and that is police forces, the length and breadth of the country. And actually, what happened with Sarah Everard's killer really was a big shock, because he was on duty, or he was purporting to be on duty, I should say. He handcuffed her. He exploited at the very worst level his position as a police officer. Now, I feel sorry for the police officers that I know personally and have worked with, because they are good, decent, honourable people. And I want to put that on record. But in all industries, whether it be banking, the industry I used to work in, whether it be medicine, engineering, where you've got thousands of people, hundreds, millions of people working in a particular industry, you will always get people who shouldn't be there and are not doing a good job. Now, for me, one of the biggest things I think in my force that has been a barrier is when police officers observe untoward behaviours amongst their own colleagues, it's the trust and confidence in reporting them to a confidential email address that they believe is not truly confidential, and therefore there could be some comeback to them. Now, the more that the actions are taken against police officers when there are effectively issues of gross misconduct and criminal behaviours, and the individual person reporting, the whistleblower, for want of a better word, doesn't see any repercussion and it is treated confidentially, this is obviously going to encourage more police officers to come forward and report issues where they know that they are not right and perhaps there is criminality amongst their peers. I think that's something in my own force that I am definitely looking at and trying to push further. There is a lot of work to be done with the public. We've had a couple of cases it's been in the press over the last couple of weeks about legally qualified chairs, LQCs, who preside over the complaints that are made about police officers. So when a chief constable decides to dismiss somebody for gross misconduct, whatever it may be, the LQC, a panel of locally qualified chairs will preside over that. And in a number of circumstances, they have been withholding the identity of the officer and withholding the identity, or some of the details of the case, hearing the cases in private session. And there has been some pushback through the media, through certain lobbying groups, quite understandably. And in some cases, to protect the identity of the victim, perhaps the individual officer's name needs to be withheld. But where it should be, I think it's absolutely right and correct to prevent these kind of behaviours as well in the future amongst other police officers, that identities are shared. I'm going to stop at that point because I'm conscious that you've got the other guests are going to be speaking as well, but very happy to answer any questions throughout the session.
Thank you very much indeed, Donna. If you don't mind, because just muting yourself, I'm going to call on Hannana now, and you need to unmute yourself, Hannana, to share with us whether or not, what you think in terms of the current landscape and whether it's in a better place or a worse place than it has been over the years.
Well, in some sense, I would say it is in a better place because we've got a public debate going on within the police force and outside of the police force. I think the Sarah Everard case really highlighted, it was a watershed moment. It highlighted gender-based violence and misogyny within the police forces and women's safety and outside of it, and the failure to protect women by the police. And I think it triggered this wider debate on institutionalized sexism. And I think that's where it has its parallels with the Stephen Lawrence case, because the Stephen Lawrence case was about institutionalized racism. And I think that if we look at the number of cases where women have died, there are intersectional issues because, if you look at the experiences of Black and minority women and women who've been killed, that there is an intersection with racism. So they experience both racism and sexism, this kind of multiple disadvantage and discrimination, which is also reflected with how Black and minority women may be treated within the police force, but also how they're treated as victims outside. Now, we deal with Black and minority women who are facing domestic abuse, honor-based violence, forced marriage, and immigration problems. And so a lot of our work is outside of the police force, but of course there is an interface with the police force. Women turn to the police for protection and prosecution and some kind of justice. And I think the cases of Nicole Smallman and Bieber Henry was an example of where, you know, you've got these high profile cases where sexism and racism came out. But on a day-to-day basis in the work that we do with women, um, recently had a focus group with the women and said, well, how do you want to address street harassment? Do you feel safe in public spaces? And a lot of these women have gone through domestic abuse, so they don't feel safe within the home, but they also don't feel safe outside on the street. And a lot of them have not really talked about this issue before, about sexual harassment and flashing and sexual abuse on the streets, often by strangers, but sometimes by their own relatives and stalkers and abusers. And again, they don't feel safe anywhere. And they said to us, well, if the police don't take domestic abuse very seriously, which is the experience of many of these women, then why would they take this harassment that I experience on the street, which is often not acknowledged and seen as low level and not that important? Migrant women also say to us, well, I don't want to report to the police because they will share the fact that I have insecure immigration status with the Home Office and I will be facing deportation. So there is this kind of reluctance to go to the police or feel that the police won't take the matter seriously. And of course, the solution for the women were, of course, you want better street lighting, you want CCTV. But the other big area was, well, also they want more resources for the policing. They found that the fact that there wasn't any police officers around, the streets are quiet, there's far fewer police officers around than there used to be in the past. And a lot of the time, women don't know where to go to report or feel they can't report things immediately. In fact, a lot of the police stations have closed down. So there is, you have to go much further to actually report a crime. And issues around police sexual harassment on the street are kind of, they don't even know who the perpetrators are. So by the time they get to the police station, they don't have the evidence and feel they can't take it forward. And I think so racism and sexism is one example of how women on a daily basis feel that they can't go to the police. They feel that they're often not believed, that there's lack of empathy, there is victim blaming. And there's also cultural assumptions made around minority women. So for example, some officers may not want to intervene in minority communities because they don't want to be seen as racist or culturally insensitive, while others are racist and maybe heavy-handed in their policing. So women do feel that they can approach them because of their perceptions or their experiences of racism against themselves or against men within their own communities. And I think I want to give one example. It's an extreme example, but it did highlight problems around policing and the attitudes of the policing. The case was of Banaz Mahmood. It's a famous case of an Iraqi Kurdish woman who was killed by her father and her uncle and 5 male cousins in an honor killing. And she, before her death, she actually did report threats to her life and an attempt to her life and against herself and her boyfriend by her own family to the police. And she did this 5 times before she was killed. And, each time she wasn't given proper help by the police. And I think one of we felt that the reason behind this was racism, but also the fear of getting involved, the fear of being culturally insensitive or religiously insensitive was a reason why we don't think that the police got involved in the case and took it seriously. Now, over the years, I've been campaigning and working around policing and, like others here, hundreds of working groups working on various policies, procedures, on best practice, on domestic abuse, on honor-based violence, and how to deal with the gender-based violence more generally. And there are some very good policies in place, which really should influence the policing of those crimes. But the big problem, I think, for us is implementation. And in many cases I've come across where, say, a junior officer wants to get involved, wants to handle a case, don't want to turn a woman away, either, don't want to be seen as culturally insensitive, doesn't mind being accused of racism, but will want to go in and protect someone. But yet the management and the senior officers want to be seen as more culturally sensitive. And often they're working hand in hand with community leaders who tend to be conservative, male and patriarchal and religious, and with very conservative value systems. And they feel that they would be kind of undermining good race relations if they got involved. The consequences of that is that women in those communities are not protected. It can easily be the other way around. Sometimes a senior officer does want to be more effective, but the junior officers don't, the rank and file don't take it seriously. And yes, there are some very good examples of policings where things have gone really well. And over the years, I would say that there has been an improvement on policing of domestic abuse, largely because there has been greater awareness and more policies and procedures in place. But there is still that canteen culture. The culture is still there and the system is still failing. The system does not fully hold individuals properly accountable. I think there's problems in the complaints and the disciplinary procedures. I think there's problems in obviously a failure to adhere to policies and procedures. Some people feel that the way to deal with this, with training, with better training, with better diverse representation. And yes, these things are so part of the solution, but they're not the complete solution, because with diverse representation, it's not, the police force reflects society. So a lot of those who come into the police force also have very conservative value systems, from either if they're from Black or minority background or from a white or majority background. They can hold racist views, they can hold sexist views. So sometimes when they're very bigoted views, training does not really deal with it. I think we need to improve procedures at a much earlier stage, which is the ethics and the vetting system needs to be improved in order to who you allow in the police force and how you hold them accountable. At the end of the day, the accountability system itself is not working well.
If we can just pause there now.
Yeah.
We'll come back to you, obviously. I'm going to ask Betsy now. As I said, we talked about the improvements of the last 2-3 decades,
Yeah.
but Betsy was pretty much there or thereabouts every single time. So it'd be good to hear from you, Betsy, as to where you think we are and what it is that you think needs to be done.
It's always a hard act to follow when Hannana talks, and it's lovely to see everyone as well. I think she and I have known each other probably 3.5 decades now. So we have, I think we've been part of this journey and discussion for such a long time. I'd like to pick up first on what Hannana has talked about, and that is this disjuncture between policy, procedure, and practice. And that's, to me, in terms of thinking about routes to disclosure and practical support, that is where I think that the locus of improvement must happen, and also the challenge. One of the problems that we have, or that I have, I guess, tried to focus on in this work that we're doing now with Operation Soteria Bluestone, which I will explain in a bit, is, how is it that we get policing to change? How is it that we actually transform the kinds of things that Hannana and I were talking about on stages 35 years ago and throughout? Why is it that particular kind of horrific cases remind us, and also the day-to-day reminds us that has not been sorted? So one of the places that I started in the Soteria journey was beginning to write a book on the policing of sexual abuse and sexual assault, and going back over the last policy reviews and documents and research and government-sponsored work over 30 years. And frankly, it's a bit scary how much they all sound alike. And the solution almost in every single report was better training. Training is not the solution. And I will now talk about what I think is important. One, everybody wants better policing. And I think that is, regardless of where we are on the spectrum of challenging violence against women, everyone wants better policing, and particularly those who somehow end up with the courage to pick up the phone or walk into the very few police stations that still exist and ask for help. So people want help. Women want help. They also expect that a public service like policing will actually contribute to our wider protection. That's part of the reason why they're a public service. But help and protection are not the kinds of things that are necessarily routinely offered. And so really I sort of got fed up about 1.5 years ago and tired of the we want to do better, and said, okay, fine. The challenge is, will you be transparent enough to let a team of researchers come in and really take a look and do a good diagnostic for you? So we are talking about, in terms of, again, routes to disclosure and practical support, is actually policing getting its house in order. And I have to say, what is different between now and 35 years ago is we are welcome, the doors are open, we are giving unprecedented access to information, and being able to actually analyze as independent academics, what we think is going on in the police service, and create a dialogue within in order to think differently about how to proceed. Our remit is to create a national operating model for the investigation of rape and sexual assault. And we're using our deep analytic work, plus our collaboration with the police services in order to do that. But that will be welded, and I'll use the word weld, to the way that the police can work. So in many ways, I'm going to be talking about an optimistic story, but I will be supporting much of what Hannana said in terms of the fact that there is a huge gap between policy, law, and implementation. And there are a variety of reasons for this. Things have changed over 35 years. Yes, we have we've had austerity over 10 years. We've lost a number of police officers, and we have a really inexperienced police force at the moment as well. So one of the things that we're doing is documenting, in many ways, the disablers. What is disabling progress? How do we get better? And how do we know we're getting better in a way that is not just about inspections, scorecards, and other kinds of performance measures? It's almost now universal that there is a tilt toward the work in rape and sexual assault. It's a tilt toward victim credibility and victim blaming. Indeed, it is often that the victim is the only one that the police service has to work with in terms of a rape report, and they need to get it resolved in many ways. And sometimes that means getting it off the books. But the person who is largely, as we are discovering and documenting, is the victim themselves become the focus of the investigation. That coupled with the fact that some of the kind of criminological facts, I hate to be a professor in this situation, but I'm gonna be, because I always have been, there's a couple of really clear facts that I think nobody in criminology fights with. I mean, it's actually a universal. One, we have repeat victims, and two, we have repeat suspects. And we have repeat suspects in the arena of sexual offending. What we have, what we're beginning to find is that the focus on identified suspects, which by the way constitute about 70 to 80% of the named sexual offenders that are named by victims, is that there is no systematic routine way. Well, there is a systematic way, but it's not being used to find out what's the past offending of this person and whether or not they are sexual offenders. So what we're doing is tilting. So what Soteria does, and you've heard the word being repeated a lot, is suspect-focused investigations. But those are actually, in many ways, can be enabled by systems that already exist within the police service itself. So what Soteria is doing is looking at the organizational and institutional disablers of policing to do that. So the workhorses doing good investigations, making sure that the people that you know who the offenders are, is that we're finding a real lack of understanding of offending in general. Now, we're describing this as specialization. That is the kind of knowledge that Hannana uses when she sits and listens to a case is not the same kind of knowledge that police officers generally use when they listen to a case. There's something about the knowledge base, which I have to say is incredibly strong now after 4 decades of research, about the way offending works against women in situations of violence. We know a lot of this. We know about grooming now. We know about sexual exploitation. We know about coercive control. These are not new things. We just have different names to talk about them. As we know, Hannana, things have changed, but the words have changed. But actually, the behavior hasn't, and it's been exacerbated by the 10 years of our total addiction to the new world, which is the digitalization of life. And that really has morphed and transformed the ways in which some of this offending does happen. So we really are advocating specialization, but it's a specialization of that kind of thing that was denigrated 35 years ago. And that is, what is it that feminists know about violence against women? How does it target it? How does it work? How does it work in their lives? How does it actually make a difference in the way in which they understand safety, security, and resource and access to law? And I think that's quite important. How am I for time? I got another.
You got about another minute.
Great. Okay. So what we are actually doing is going in and looking at the kinds of enablers that the police services might not be, I have to say, as efficient. And one of those is in the area that we called training, people called training. Actually, these days, it's about learning, development, and well-being of officers who are doing really, really hard work. So we are looking at the way in which officers have the skills, mold those skills to understand and incorporate specialist knowledge, and continue to develop the way in which sexual offending changes over time. We should not have been surprised that repeat offenders who like to work the bars, I'll use that in quotes, turned immediately to Tinder under COVID. We should not have been surprised. And yet, if a victim reported a Tinder encounter, she might have been initially asked, well, why did you go out and why did you have, you're not allowed to have any contact with people. What are you having? Lots of things happened under COVID. We shouldn't, we need to understand how it happened, why it happened, but not blame people for it. So offenders, they learned really quickly how to morph. That knowledge base was not quickly added in terms of the way one thinks about policing. I could go on, but I won't. So I do think that what we're doing in Soteria is really putting on the table the kinds of rich analytic information that, by the way, we were talking about 35 years ago, but actually it is strewn all over the police records. We know this stuff. This stuff is now enabling us to try to tilt the way in which policing works and to actually transform its own internal ways of working so that it can align itself with better safety, protection, and decision-making for victims who access law.
Thank you very much indeed, Betsy. Underlying all of this is the culture of the force itself. I mean, the people that work in the police services up and down the country will determine how things are done and whether some things are investigated, whether some things aren't. And so the culture is absolutely critical to this. And that's why I'm hopeful that Rhona can share some of her experience, but also some of the learning that she's had to come across during her experiences. So Rhona, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Wow, what a phenomenal amount of information that everybody has just shared there. It's a really great insight to see the other side, because obviously as a police officer I was dealing with a lot of it like boots on the ground, you know, so it's quite nice to see how you perceive it. So there's lots of stuff, I've taken lots of notes there, but from my own experience, I think what's important, where I think I'll start is when we're talking about routes to disclosure. So I was a police officer for over 10 years. When I joined the police force, I was about 33 years old, so I did have a lot of life experience anyway before I started. However, what I would say is you become institutionalized really quickly. And I didn't see that until after I left policing. And when I say institutionalized, it's a disciplined organization, and that is thrown at you quite a lot. You know your place, you follow orders, there's a reason why systems are in place, and you soon, and I explain this to people, it's like a domestic abuse situation. You become so entrenched in the life that is the police force that you start losing your family, your friends, because of the shifts that you're on, the people that you're working with. And so those are your main influencers, the people that you like that I was around all the time. They could be good, bad, or indifferent, but they were my main influencers because of the shifts, because of the time that you spend with these people. When I look back, you know, at the last 10 years, I mean, it's been a huge awakening. That's how it feels after I've left the police. But when I look back, you know, my family did come second place because of the pressure of what that job puts on you. You know, the culture, which is very significant in the police, that is like a vein of poison that runs through the whole organisation. And it's from very early on, you realise you don't complain. You know, submitting a grievance is a huge thing to do, because the minute you do that, you've got a target on your back. So when the discrimination happened to me, when I was experiencing bullying and intimidation, when I joined the firearms division, it was new to me, because it was a very unique and individual division, and they'd made themselves that way, and they were allowed to do that. So it was very micromanaged, very controlling. And when I moved into that division, as I said, it was very, it was even the pressure not to stand up or speak out was worse than ever, and it made me feel really uncomfortable. So I'm jumping a bit back and forward, but the first 7 years, I'd say, of my policing career, on hindsight, I can see the words and the language and the behaviour that I experienced was discrimination, there was misogyny there, but I never identified that the whole time I was there. So looking back, in those 7 years, I think or believed that wasn't going on. When I went to the firearms division, I experienced it in waves. It was phenomenal. It was like hitting a brick wall. You know, the being a woman, it was suddenly black and white in my face, and it was painful. But there was nobody there to protect me, to look after me, to keep me safe. So, you know, you know, I was trying to protect myself for a long time. When I did take that huge step, which, believe me, any police officer that submits a grievance, it is a huge step, because you're basically your career's going to end, or you're going to be a target. You know, you don't think for 1 minute you're going to be kept safe. But when I submitted that, there was so many things happening. I had to protect my job, because I was getting accused of misconduct. I'd been accused of throwing a loaded gun, which never happened. So I didn't have a choice. I had to put that grievance in, because otherwise I was going to be, you know, by senior officers, I was being described and communicated as a problem, that I had mental health issues, you know, a lot of these things that were coming about. So Donna, you mentioned something quite specific about the whistleblowing in the email. So just to go back to that, that's quite pertinent, especially in my case, because whistleblowers in Police Scotland, there is an email address, I think there is a phone number that takes you direct to PSD, or it ends up at PSD, which is Professional Standards Department. And it was the Professional Standards Department in my employment tribunal that were found to be, I mean, I don't have the wording in front of me, but a chief superintendent basically said that my grievance, one of my grievances wasn't dealt with because he didn't get an email. Now, this is somebody that's probably got a PA. I've no doubt he's got a PA. And I don't know why he fell on his sword and said that in my employment tribunal. But when you've got people at that rank that are protecting other people, you know, that's what police officers are up against. So with the Sarah Everard case and the WhatsApp and the police officers who knew what this person was like and they knew he was bad, I'm not making excuses for them, not at all. They have to take responsibility for that, absolutely. But with reference to other police officers around the country, I know how fearful, how painful, how worrying it is to stand up and say and support somebody, because you are totally alienated, you are pushed out. And when you're institutionalized, like what I was, that's painful, that's grief, that's like your family, that's somebody really close to you basically turning their back on you, shutting the door and letting you, and you have to survive yourself. You know, it's a culture that's created from the minute you walk in that door. And how you change that, I do have some ideas, and I think we're talking about that later, Nazir.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. Betsy, you had mentioned about the training, not a solution. Totally agree. I don't think training is ever going to help the police to change, because it's so far in depth now, the problems, and there needs to be another solution. And I love the disabling progress. I love that term, because there are so many people that are disabling progress, that are stopping it. But these people, because of cronyism, nepotism, collusion, there's a lack of regulation and a total lack of transparency with them. So that is how training is never going to work, because you've got that issue straight away. There was something else, sorry. Also, what I found is, and I'm trying to highlight this wherever possible, is the police will say what they want the public to hear. Nobody is able to hold them to account for that. So, and if somebody does, like myself, it takes years. You know, I'm still trying to get that accountability. I got acknowledgement in my employment tribunal, but I've not got accountability, because the very people that were all named, and I mean, the judge gave a great description of everybody that gave evidence in my trial, and how the judge and the lay people perceived them. You know, I mean, it's horrendous how she has spoken about those police officers and police staff, and yet nobody has been held to account yet. So that was October, my findings came out. So for me, that's, I mean, that is communicating to the police, to the institutionalized police, which they are, they probably deny it, but they are, that you can do whatever you want and there are no repercussions. You will not be held to account, you are safe. So the people that are doing the wrongdoing are nurtured, they're supported. Whereas I was continually, every opportunity, suppressed and neglected and pushed to the side. NDAs, I don't know how much time I've got, Nazir.
Rhona, we got about a minute, Rhona.
Okay, so NDAs is a part of the problem within policing as well, because when I raised my complaint and tried to, And, you know, I was going through it for many years. It was so difficult to find women who'd experienced the same thing that I had. I knew there must have been women there, and I slowly did find them, but they've all signed NDAs. So they can't, there's a fear of speaking out. So women's equality is absolutely been obstructed because of NDAs. And you've got the police force who are willing to just dish them out at every opportunity when they know that, okay, we have to put our hands up, we'll give some money out and we'll send an NDA. You've then got a police federation who, are basically, sorry, sometimes I get a bit blank when I go through things. So you've got the police forces that dish them out and the federation enforces them. That's what I wanted to say. So you've got a federation who aren't really there supporting police officers. They have got their own aims and objectives. And I can't speak for the Police Federation of England and Wales. I can certainly speak for the Scottish Police Federation. And they absolutely have made no progress, effort, or have done anything publicly in support of women. In fact, they've done the complete opposite. So sorry.
No, thank you, Rhona. That is very powerful testimony. What I hope we can do over the next 20 minutes or so is have a conversation between ourselves, but based on what people have said, Rhona made the very strong point about NDAs. When NDAs were first created, they were created to, they're a bit like the anonymity for victims, i.e. they're meant to protect the victim, but more often than not, Donna, they end up protecting the reputation of the institution. And there's a perception, isn't there, that institutions, including the police, just preserve and protect their own reputation, regardless of the impact it might have more widely. And that, of course, you know, people are used to what they call cover-ups now, and they don't. It doesn't help in terms of developing trust, does it?
No, it really doesn't. And as I said in my opening gambit about the locally qualified chairs, you know, such a key part that they play. They're appointed by police and crime commissioners. That is the role that your commissioner in whichever part of the country you live in, with the exception of Scotland, who has a slightly different, actually from Rhona's perspective, slightly different model in Scotland and in Northern Ireland. But in England and Wales, your police and crime commissioner has the governance over the locally qualified chairs. And I wrote to the chair of my LQC panel last week to say, I want you to start with the disposition that you are going to be publishing the identity of a police officer if they are sacked for gross misconduct, and that you should be hearing or publishing the outcome of the hearing in its detail after the hearing has concluded. And if somebody is innocent, fine, but if they're guilty, you know, the public are entitled to the information. Now, if there is, that's the starting position. It's a bit like the presumption of bail, isn't it, when you're in court, and for the CPS to prove why there shouldn't be bail given. Exactly that kind of presumption for the LQC. And of course, there will always be circumstances to protect the anonymity of children or the identity of children or of vulnerable witnesses, of course, if there are those circumstances. So it's not an absolute black and white. However, I really want my LQCs who preside over cases in Hampshire to be doing it with confidence that actually, if a police officer has done wrong, one of the best ways to stop that happening in the future is to name and shame. It's just the same with criminals. It's exactly the same reason why police comms departments, the length and breadth of the country, and the NCA and the Home Office, you know, when our crime fighting agencies in this country get a good sentence, when they've caught a drug smuggling gang, when they've caught a people smuggling gang, they will plaster it, they'll put it all over social media, they'll put out press releases, hoping it gets picked up in the printed press. They do that for a reason, to put off other criminals. And this is exactly the same pretense. And the point that Rhona made about the fear, and I mentioned this in the very beginning as well, around one of the barriers to reporting, particularly from police officers or police staff within forces about colleagues, is that fear of being able to do it in that confidential way. And again, if you have reported and then it ends up being in the press that someone has been sacked and your identity is protected, the more that happens, the more that good practice is shared, the more confidence and trust and confidence will come from within policing themselves. I do want to repeat the point I made earlier, my final point, Nazir, that I said at the very beginning. I work with, well, we've got thousands of police officers and police staff that work in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And obviously in my role with national lead for both serious organised crime and also victims, I'm working with officers across the whole country. And the vast, vast, vast majority are good, honest, decent people that want to do a good job. So I don't want this to be an absolute slating of police across the country. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying there are not significant room for improvements, but what I do want to be clear is the majority of these men and women are hardworking, decent and honest, but where there are bad examples, because they're in such an empowered and trusted position, it's important that it is called out and it's highlighted publicly.
I'm glad you said that. If I can move on a little bit to the language that we use. We constantly hear this thing about victim blaming. And I think, Betsy, you made the point that police focus on the credibility of the complainant, stroke victim, because they don't have a suspect. Even if they do have a suspect, they focus on her credibility first and foremost, rather than what you would want, and what I suspect we all want, which is to investigate the suspect, because that might actually get us somewhere. Why does that happen, Betsy? Why is it? I understand, that's the person's approach to them, but why doesn't it occur to them that they might want to investigate the suspect in those cases?
Well, if I can link this with what Hannana was talking about in terms of cultural assumptions as well. They basically seep into decision-making. Partially, I'm not going to say whether there are some officers who believe rape myths and stereotypes and are quite uninformed and ill-informed around diversity and difference. But by and large, I think that the legal institutions and law itself supports the undermining of victims. We cannot be in a position where we have charge rates that are bad. Even worse. Like, how do you account for charge rates how do you account for 97% of reports not being charged? One. Two, how do you account for a woeful prosecution rate of that under 3%? And three, how do you account for even more woeful convictions? Even though the CPS in England and Wales boasts of a 75% conviction rate, at a 97% charge rate, that's still woeful. So in many ways, we're in a situation in this country with rape and sexual assault that is a virtual decriminalization of rape, and that we need to think about how that happens. Part of what is going on as well, I think, is that we need to think about the way, and I use the word tilt because there are a number of things going on. We also know that many victims want validation by reporting, but not necessarily through a criminal justice outcome. And we need to understand that. What we want is to take a look at the stream, of which there are many cases where there are issues around drugs, drinking, chaotic lifestyles, all the kinds of things that people tend to undermine credibility. But actually, what we know from the work of psychologists who work on sexual offending is actually strong reasons why offenders target those victims, because their very credibility is already undermined. So it is really important for us to begin to turn the way in which rape myths seep into and police officers are no different than other members of the public, really, in that way. But as Rhona's talked about, some of that gets accentuated, exacerbated in a really institutionally, hermeneutically sealed place. And they become common knowledge justifications for not putting things forward to the CPS. And that ends up with an outcome. So now that we're able to name it, document it, show it, and work with it, because I think we can in a really strong way in Bluestone, is that we have been able to begin to turn around what it is about offending that targets vulnerability. And offending starts with victims. Starts with offenders, not victims. And in many ways, victims are targeted because they know. Hannana knows this again in terms of the right to remain. Offenders specifically tell women you're going to be deported if you complain. mean, they specifically use the vulnerability of the person that they're abusing in order to abuse more and to disarm their ability to use law. So that's the logic, the narrative, and the language that we ought to be using in our reports, in the way in which we ask victims to describe what happens, the way in which we can actually interview suspects with that knowledge base of how they offend and why they offend, and get them to explain it, because we have a stronger way of aligning that our knowledge base with law practice. It's just not institutionalized, it's not common practice, and we really do need to get, as Rhona said, get inside the police service. I'm lucky, I spent 20 years inside the police service. I know how they feel and they think and they work and they talk. I also had an advantage that I was a university professor in the same way. So I found ways, and we find ways of translating the kind of ways in which you work differently and how you can work differently, because, as Donna says, there are many officers out there who want to do the right job, but they actually are being disabled by their own organizations.
Yeah. Thank you, Betsy. I think Rhona, you wanted to say something. I'll come to you in a moment, Hannana.
Yeah, sorry, I think that's really pertinent, Betsy, what you've just said. The reports that go to the Procurator Fiscal in Scotland certainly are written by police officers. So it's their interpretation of the victim, it's their interpretation of the suspect, it's their biases, judgments, their previous knowledge, their conditioning, everything about that police officer is put into that report, even when you take a statement. You know, a statement should be taken verbatim, but we're so behind, everything's done by hand. It shouldn't be done by hand anymore, it should be recorded, because that's when you get a true feel and understanding what a victim's went through. And I think that would, I mean, it's so important to, I think, to communicate that, is that the information that's going to a Procurator Fiscal is based on a police officer. Now, if you've got police officers, the ones that I'm dealing with and that Zara ever are dealt with, you've got a huge problem there. Sorry, that's all I wanted to say.
No, I'm glad you said that. And I think Donna pointed out that the policing community, 120,000 strong, will be reflective of society. The only difference, of course, is the police officer has a warrant card. And when you have power and you're a bigot, that makes you very, very dangerous. But I think we need to constantly say that we're talking about a significant minority of police officers. And Hannana, you've been mentioned a number of times by Betsy in terms of what your learning and your understanding. I remember when we first started talking about honor-based abuse, well, I first started talking about it 20 years ago. Time and time again, officers were saying that's what they do to each other. You know, the assumptions. In fact, I remember one officer saying to me, well, they won't report to the police because they don't trust the police back home. It doesn't matter, you were born in Southall, you know, back home. So what steps have we taken? What steps can be taken to tackle that particular, the assumptions that are made? You're on mute, Hannana.
I think the police have got to come to the realization that victims of abuse are reporting primarily because they want protection. Most of them do come forward to get protection, even if they don't trust the police. In an emergency, who do you call? You call the police. And a lot of women do that. The problem is how the police respond to that call, whether or not they let them down or whether or not they support them. And of course, there are officers who do support them. And I think, obviously, if they have bigoted views, if they have sexist or racist views, that's going to reflect in how they handle that case. But there's also a problem of lack of awareness as well. You know, understanding certain cultures, understanding gender-based violence or gender inequality. I think police officers should understand the notion of power and control. I think that there needs to be a better understanding of how power and control is used to abuse someone and how violence is used to control someone, and how is that done within the context of gender inequality and discrimination. You need that wider framework to really locate someone's experience. And I don't think that the police get enough of that in their training, in their development work, in understanding how power is abused, and how it can, how it's then sort of translated into different communities. So, it's using someone's immigration status as a form of control. A lot of police officers wouldn't understand that, when a lot of police officers don't understand that marital rape in Asian communities, actual rape. Otherwise, they make the assumption that, rape, within sex within marriage is accepted within that culture, and it's not a form of rape. So these are all the issues we've come across in terms of these cultural assumptions that police make about certain communities as well. And the training, the problem with training is, yes, it doesn't entirely work, but it does work with some people. And one of the problem is that they don't even invite groups like us to go and give training anymore. We used to go and give training free of charge. We didn't even charge of it. But when I've been asking recently about involving us in training, it's, well, no, we can't afford it. But they never paid us in the first place. The point is they're using an excuse, not involving, they don't have proper community engagement. Part of the community engagement is about involving groups like ourselves in their training, rather than what they consider as their race experts, who actually often have very conservative views around women anyway. And the liaison work that they do is with the community leadership, which tend to be quite conservative. So they still don't quite know how to engage with minority communities, and particularly how to engage with women in those communities who lack power. There's a total lack of understanding of power.
No, absolutely. Of course, and around the country now, we're beginning to understand the sort of public health approach that's needed to tackle this issue, which is not just dealing with the criminal justice consequences or the effect of something, but what causes it in the first place. So the misogyny that drives much of it. Yeah. I personally don't like using the word violence against women and girls, because invariably it's male violence we're talking about. Yeah. And if we call it what it is, then we might actually be able to address it. I think there's something you said earlier on. We've said earlier on that implementation or lack of implementation is the problem. Now, let me ask Donna, really, because Donna, you're in a position of where you can implement. We know there's some great policies, there's some great guidelines, over the decades there's been fantastic stuff. We've all got, I know that, policing has got loads of project managers and program managers. Why is it not getting implemented?
I think that when you have big organisations like police forces, and actually, again, this is something that Rhona said at the very beginning, it's a command structure, it's very rigid, you get institutionalised very quickly because this is the way things have always been done. And I do understand that when you've got an organisation where people are carrying, as Rhona did, a firearm, when you've got people who've got, listening devices, when you've got people who are privy to counter-terrorism information, you have to have that command structure. I totally get that. But as a consequence of it being quite rigid, a bit like the armed forces with their command structures, turning the ship around in a different direction is not an easy thing to do. And it's something that I've learned. And, you mentioned earlier, Nazir, that I worked in banking. I worked in, it's my professional background. I'm a qualified banker. And I did that before I had my kids. And after I had my children, I had a career break for a couple of years, and then decided I did go back to work and got my reauthorization. Took a year to do that. And then said to my husband, I don't want to do this anymore. I really wanted to give something back. I wanted to be in a role where I was giving something back, volunteering. That's when I became a magistrate a number of years ago, which of course pays nothing. I was a lay member of the judiciary. I had to give that up last year when I was elected, obviously, into this role because of the conflict. But one thing that I have realised, having now been in the public sector for best part of 15 years, but having worked for a FTSE 50 company in this country, is that the private sector responds much quicker. And why do they do that? Because, yeah, okay, they're answerable to their shareholders, you could say, but it's not the same level as accountability as local governance, non-government organisations, local government, central government, and elections and politics. It confuses everything. and it slows everything down. It coagulates the whole system. And that's why I think that what's happened last year, this watershed moment, as you said at the very beginning, Nazir, and it has been a watershed moment, but it shouldn't have taken the rape and murder of a poor girl in South London in March 2021 for this to happen. But what I would say is that we are getting there. The more we have, you know, events like this, the more we're talking about it, the more things are covered. We all need to keep talking about this agenda, and particularly that trust and confidence. And exactly this whole session is about breaking down and looking at the barriers to reporting, the barriers to why people are not coming forward. The more we talk about it, the more people become aware, the more they're aware of their rights, the more their confidence rises. And that also rubs off on police officers and police staff themselves as well. But like I say, it's a command structure. It's been like that for a number of years, and because that's the way it's always been, it's going to be harder and more difficult to turn it around. I do want to just say one thing as well. I am on the Operation Soteria board with Betsy, so you know I've given evidence at the Home Affairs Select Committee with Sarah Crew, who trialled the Operation Bluestone in Avon and Somerset, an excellent was deputy, now chief constable, and actually Operation Soteria has a good strategic focus thanks to Betsy and the work that she's been doing to support the government there. But, you know, in my force in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, we were not an Operation Soteria force straight off the bat. They've just announced the second wave of Operation Soteria. We are in that one. But I didn't wait for the government to give me a title. You know, I spoke to my chief. We started implementing Operation Soteria processes last year. We've got a dedicated RASO investigation team in our CIDs across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. Not all police forces have. I was on a call this morning with Maggie Blythe, the dedicated policing lead for VORG. I was on her board this morning, and then we had a telephone call at lunchtime, you know, talking to her about how it's not good enough now that VORG has become a strategic policing requirement. You know, all police forces, in my opinion, should have that dedicated RASO team. CPS should be supporting across the country a uniformed approach to having not just CPS online, but having a dedicated for early investigative advice, particularly around rape and serious sexual offences. That you know, and it's things like this, breaking down, chipping away, making sure that that's how I think we're going to change some of these practices and effectively improve things for the victims, or should I say the survivors out there.
No, that's absolutely fair of you to say that, and you don't need to wait for national edict, do you? You can do it yourself, because you know, if you know it works, it works. I think one before I round up and ask you to give us your closing statements with hopefully some recommendations for change, can I ask a little question really of perhaps Rhona here? If there, you know, when you have a culture where people are a big sexist or misogynistic or racist, whatever it is, and the cousin's case, you know, where people knew he was, you know, acting inappropriately, but nothing was done. What is there a case for a sort of a legal duty almost on people to report even minor concerns about some into policing, because of what we said earlier on about Donna, when we talked about the difference between me and a member of the public and the police is they have a warrant card. There ought to be, you know, in your situation when you couldn't whistleblow or you tried to whistleblow, Rhona, you know, had you been able to say something and being encouraged to say something about what people have said earlier, that would have made a difference.
Absolutely. There are regulations in place, though, where it is a police officer's duty to report wrongdoing. And that's not been abided by. It's not been followed. It's not been upheld. Nobody's held to account when that doesn't happen. So you've got a huge problem there. The processes and procedures that are in place for complaints are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. The problem is that they are being misused, they're being manipulated, they're being abused by power. And nobody's regulating that because of the collusion, the corruption, the collusion, the cronyism, nepotism that goes on. You know, police officers are normally in the police from a very young age, and they all know each other. They all get to, you know each other. Education, I think, is key, absolutely primary, especially, I didn't know what misogyny was until this started for me. I speak to many colleagues that I used to work with. You know, we talk about language and and behaviour, and they don't acknowledge that as misogynistic, where it glaringly and obviously is. So education is key. Going back to what Hannana said about, you know, offering training and them, you know, rejecting it and not taking it on, I actually understand that, because the police officers are drowning. You know, they're trying to keep their head above water. There are not enough police officers, boots on the street. And so I think training becomes then a secondary priority. It's not the priority, it's keeping people safe, where it's like a vicious circle, because if you don't put the right training and education into police officers, then it's going to actually start creating problems, which we have now seen. So yeah, I think if I go on to one of the solutions that I believe is very is imperative, is an independent complaints body that is not run by police officers or government or anything to do with previous, you know, ex-police officers or current. I think to change a culture is a very difficult thing. It's like turning the Titanic. However, if you take that out of the policing entirely, then you have people who will start to trust and believe in a system that works if they start seeing people held to account and they get the acknowledgement that they want. Right now, you will never get that in the police force. And I don't know what amount of training it would take to do that, but it's just so, the institution is just so great that I don't think it would be possible any other way.
Well, thank you, Rhona.
That's one of the solutions that I would say is required.
I think the analogy of turning the Titanic may not be the appropriate one, given where that ended up. Can I ask everybody now? This is really, as I said, the whole point of this manifesto, these policing vodcasts episodes, is to come up with recommendations. So can I ask each individually for 2 or 3 minutes, please, max, to share with us what you think we should do differently. So Donna, can I ask you first?
Yeah, thank you, Nazir. And as I say, once again, thank you for allowing me to be part of this today. I think for me, it's around publication of cases of gross misconduct when those individual officers are dismissed from police forces. I think the more that the police see that, the more the public see that there is action being taken when there is wrongdoing, the more that, one, it will prevent that bad behaviour within police forces because they know they're likely to get sacked for it. And secondly, the public will realise that there is action and consequences for police officers themselves when they've done wrong, and that their complaints are being taken seriously. Secondly, I think we also need to focus on how we're going to rebuild the trust and confidence in policing, and that means sharing good practice too. So when police officers are doing an excellent job, and actually police forces are pretty good at sharing their own good practice anyway, through their social media, through their Twitter accounts, through their Facebook pages, but we do need to, keep repeating to the public that the vast majority of police officers are here to help and support. I think that I'm from a victim's perspective, the new victims bill coming down the line, and the fact that it looks like victims will have a right to have their own advocacy service and support through the judicial process is key. Yes, we have IDFAs, independent domestic violence advocates, and ISFAs, independent sexual violence advocates, that support from a charity behind the scenes, but actually having that ISFA, for example, if you've been raped, in the court with you, almost kind of supporting you as witness care do if you are in the courthouse, is going to be absolutely key. I'm really pleased as well today that the MOJ have launched the publication, the consultation on the £1.5 million extra to go into legal aid. Very, very needed, massively underfunded, and a big reason why so many defence solicitors have moved out of the defence criminal justice market. Again, that's not good for victims because it's slowing down the court recovery. So we need that to happen as well. So from my perspective, I think there is a lot still to be done. We're getting there. We need to keep talking about it. We need to be working with the media as well to make sure that both sides of the arguments are being presented. But my closing gambit to everyone is that, as I say, the vast majority of law enforcement people in this country, of police officers and people that work for the NCA and others, are extremely professional, honourable people who want to help, and I hope the public bear that in mind.
Thank you very much, Donna. Hannana, same to you. Any major recommendations you think we can implement?
Well, obviously, I would like action on all fronts. I think you have to do that, but I think there are issues, like I said before, training's not the only answer, but it should be there. And it should be involving groups like ourselves. There should be better community engagement. There should be a better vetting process, looking at ethics and standards at the very beginning when officers are recruited. In terms of how do you make people accountable, I think it's really important to have that independent complaints procedure, but that also has to go hand in hand with very effective disciplinary procedures, which are actually upholding decisions around misconduct, which I don't think that we're getting. I think the naming and shaming is really important. We have to find a system where whoever makes the grievance within the police force or outside of it does have support and representation, that they are not isolated. You need to deal with the question of isolation and alienation because they're going to be on their own trying to do this. But they need also, of course, the victims. I think it's really important to a victim to have an advocate, which is another measure. But I think anyone who's making a complaint should also have an advocate. And it should be a free advocate. I think getting, you don't even get properly paid legal aid to go to tribunal. It's ridiculous. But also within the disciplinary procedures, I found, cases just don't go that far. And the kind of, even when you are successful in a disciplinary procedure, you get very low penalties. In Banaz Mahmood's case, the worst we did go to we got a complaint that was upheld, but the disciplinary procedure wasn't upheld against the worst offenders, and all they were given was words of advice. So, and mainly because they refused to, there were problems with getting witnesses, which they really shouldn't have had relied on that evidence because there was vast amounts of evidence already available to show misconduct. So I think those procedures need to be changed, and yes, and they should be named and shamed. And the way you're going to get progress is case by case. It's a slow way to uphold, to get accountability. You're going to have to do it case by case so that other officers know that they are not going to be supported through their misconduct, and therefore they are going to have to change rather than the victims.
Thank you so much, Hannana. Betsy, same to you, really. You're obviously working on some solutions, but perhaps you can share any that you're not working on.
Yeah, well, there are a couple I'm not working on, but one of the things I think will aid our progress is transparency and openness of policing, because it is very much, again, I have talked about it being hermeneutically sealed, but in many ways, the ability of our teams to be able to go in and actually see things through a different lens, through an independent eye, and then feeding that back, reflecting that back. We are the mirrors through which the police are able to see that actually there are ways and means and a mandate to change the way they actually do things. So we're not manufacturing any information that doesn't generate from the police themselves. We're using that to try to find a way of doing it differently and implementing change within. But I have to say, the police service itself, the way the organization works, the way learning and development, which I would call training, learning and development, because it's a positive thing, they need to learn, is very much separate from the rest of the organization, separate and disconnected to understanding actual performance and the kinds of things that disable good investigation. So we're trying to link those things much stronger. Two other things that I think in terms of some interesting possibilities is the NFA panels, no further action panels that are being used. They should have independent community-led participants on those panels. And that's when you begin to see, again, the transparency of the kinds of decisions that are actually made. And I have to say, in many of the NFA panels that have been going on recently, there have been challenges to decisions the police and Crown prosecution made and re-investigated cases. So that's an interesting move. And I'll go in controversial and say, I think there should be independent legal advice.
Thank you so much, Betsy. And finally to you, Rhona. You've already shared your one around the independent complaints body. Any other recommendations you would have based on your experience?
Absolutely. So for officers to feel safe and supported and to want to make a complaint, we absolutely need an independent complaints body, without a doubt. There is a huge social injustice about getting justice as well. For myself, it costs me it's going to cost well over 100,000 by the time I'm finished, and I'm not finished yet, just to get accountability. So I've got acknowledgement, I'm looking for accountability, but the social injustice is huge. So if I didn't have the money from my parents to have paid for that, I wouldn't have been able to get it. So I believe that there should be a practice in place once there's an independent complaints body, that should it then progress to ACAS or to an employment tribunal, then the police organisation is responsible for paying both legal fees until such time that it's all finished. And then whoever is found to be responsible then is responsible for paying those fees in full. But I do believe that Police Scotland absolutely used public money to drag out my case. It definitely did. And there was no accountability. There's been no regulation about the amount of money that they have spent to, and the energy and effort they have put into silencing me. And it was a case that was going to win. You know, it was just the difficulty of getting it to court is just phenomenal. So that needs to be taken away. I think they've got the power and they've got the authority to hold victims back from getting justice, and that's not right. That isn't right. So, and NDAs should not be used in any public body. That should be they should get rid of them. They're criminal in themselves.
Thank you so much, Rhona. Just summarising, firstly, can I thank you all? That has been an extremely illuminating debate for formidable women who know more about this subject than probably everybody watching this particular episode. But in terms of what I've just picked up from your recommendations, we evidently know there's some good stuff happening out there. And taking Donna's point, don't wait to be told by the Home Office or by the National Police Chiefs Council. You know, if it's working, get it in and get it happening now so you can start delivering a better service. Yeah, we know that I think there's a pretty solid support for some kind of independent complaints body, which will properly supported so that people can make a complaint. We know that that requires safe and effective whistleblowing. That has to be in place. We know that the earlier the intervention takes place, in terms of dealing with people who are potentially on the journey towards discipline, the more likely it is you prevent them from going down that route. We know that the Victims Bill will help when it's enacted. As Donna said, the legal aid needs to be in place to enable people to get the support that they properly need. To take the point that Hannana made, and I think others have endorsed, one of the first things that goes in times of austerity is community engagement. The second thing that goes is training. And both of those are absolutely essential for the policing service to understand the concerns that their communities have. We've touched already on the need for proper disciplinary accountability, and also a word that I think all of us have used is transparency. If you try and hide some things, that will not in any way, shape or form improve integrity and the public's perception and the public's confidence in policing. And we've heard from Betsy about the NFA panels. We introduced them a decade or so ago. We know they work. Linked to that, we need to think, and policing needs to think about who represents the community, which is what Hannana's point was. You know, very often I've wasted enormous amounts of time sitting with somebody purporting to be a community leader who leads no community. And you've got to make sure that the people who are engaged with on these panels and the police engagements generally are reflective of the people that they serve. So on that point, can I thank Hannana Siddiqui, Betsy Stanko, Rhona Malone, and Donna Jones And thank you for listening, and hope that you will carry on listening to the Policing TV programs.